Zora Neale Hurston writes about the many obstacles that Black women face in the world. I discuss this and more on today's episode. Welcome back to Around the Weird, a booktube channel where I talk about all the unusual and out of the ordinary literature that I found in my travels. Today, I want to talk about a book that I've read, the final book that was on my 2025 TBR that I have yet to check off. And today's book is all about Black women, abusive husbands, and the Jim Crow South. I am referring to Their Eyes Were Watching God, a pretty interesting title, by Zora Neale Hurston, which was published in 1937. I've talked about Zora Neale Hurston on this channel before. I think I highlighted one of her short stories, so I don't need to go into that great detail. Just know that she was a Black American writer who lived in the 1900s. She was part of the Harlem Renaissance, writing in that literary period. And that cultural period, and she wrote quite a few books, including this one, which is well celebrated, or was later celebrated. It wasn't really appreciated in her time, and she wrote short stories, and she wrote literary analysis and reviews as well. She was a very interesting person, being described as somewhat libertarian in nature. She didn't really like communism. She effectively criticized the communist nature of other writers, which is strange. And then she had her own weird beliefs. She went back and forth on liking Booker T. Washington, who was a controversial figure in the Black community. And then her writing was sort of rediscovered later after her death, and was more appreciated then. But that's something I'll talk about later in the analysis section. So without further ado, let's talk about Their Eyes Were Watching God. I will do a summary, a little bit of analysis, and we will move on from there. So Their Eyes Were Watching God focuses on Janie. At the start of the story, she is a 40-year-old Black woman who returns home after her husband dies, having been away for some time, and she meets up with a friend and proceeds to basically tell her life story. She talks about how she had a sexual awakening in her teen years, and fell in love with a boy, and her grandmother caught her kissing this boy and was upset. Her grandmother was a former slave who was sexually abused by her owner, her master, and that resulted in the birth of her child, or Janie's mother, who had her own struggles and was a multiracial individual. Janie's mother leaves before she can really raise Janie, and her fathers were not really in the picture, so she's raised by her grandmother. And her grandmother decides that she wants Janie to get married to avoid all the mistakes that she and her mother went through, and so she ends up getting her married to a man in the community named Logan, who doesn't really seem to care about Janie and is only interested in having a house servant of some type, someone to clean up the mess. Janie is wondering when the love will really arise in the relationship, which it never does. Her grandmother calls her naive for that, and later her grandmother dies, and Janie's all alone. Eventually she meets a man named Joe Starks, who flirts with her and says very kind things to her, and Janie realizes that she loves Joe rather than Logan. So she just tells Logan that she's leaving. He doesn't really seem to care, and she goes off with Joe Starks, and they travel to Eatonville, Florida, where Joe makes some money off the land and then is elected mayor of this predominantly Black community. Joe ends up, doing pretty well for himself. The townsfolk want to learn more about Janie since she's the mayor's wife, but Joe just wants her to be a trophy wife and keep to herself. This upsets Janie, and over the years, a pretty long marriage, it turns into abuse. He kind of abuses her, and it becomes loveless, and Janie's not really happy by the end of it. Joe develops a kidney disease, and on his deathbed, Janie pretty much tells him that he never really understood her, so she didn't really love him. Joe is unhappy about this, and he ends up dying, and Janie gets an inheritance from it all, which draws the attention of various suitors who want in on that sort of thing and don't believe that a woman should have that kind of money. Janie pushes all the suitors away, doesn't really let them get close, but she does allow a mysterious drifter by the name of Tea Cakes to get close to her. They develop a bit of a friendship, which develops into a relationship. He convinces her to move to Jacksonville, Florida, which the townspeople think is quite strange, and she lives with Tea Cake for the next number of years, dealing with Tea Cake's wild gambling behavior and his just extravagance and whatnot. They're able to live somewhat modestly with the inheritance money. Unfortunately, some years later, a hurricane hits, and in their desperation to get to Palm Beach to avoid, the flood and whatnot, they try to walk there, and Tea Cake gets bitten by a wild dog, which produces rabies. And it's far too late that he seeks help, and he ends up growing a little bit mad in the process, and he threatens to shoot Janie. Luckily, she has a gun, and she manages to shoot him, which unfortunately kills him. And then there is a trial, because they got a whole, find out if she's guilty or not. And they eventually decide that she, is a victim of circumstance here and isn't to be jailed or anything like that. Although the black community attends the trial, and they are upset that she killed Tea Cake, someone who was beloved. But they eventually forgive her and want her to forget all the mean things they said. They have the funeral, which celebrates Tea Cake's very interesting life. And then she decides that she doesn't really want to be in this community anymore because of the memories, and she returns home. And that's really where the story kind of began in the first place. And she says farewell to Phoebe and goes back to her home, where she sort of revels in the memories of Tea Cake and other good things that have happened to her in her life. And that's where the story ends there. In terms of analysis, there is quite a bit worth talking about with this story. A lot of very interesting things that Zora Neale Hurston has to say, as well as some interesting criticism that from other writers. The first thing we're talking about is obviously the title. It's a very fascinating title, and even before I picked it up and read it, I was like, wow, this title is very strange. Their eyes were watching God. What does that mean? If I had to guess, not based on anything in the writing, I would say that there and that are the men, and they are looking upon Janie, viewing her as a sort of mythical, goddess-like figure. I don't think that quite works, since why would you abuse a goddess-like figure, which is what most of those men did. But there is another point in this story where they specifically say their eyes were watching God. Allow me to read you an interesting quote from this. They sat in company with the others in other shanties, their eyes straining against crude walls and their souls asking if he meant to measure their puny might against his. They seemed to be staring at the dark, but their eyes were watching God. Which is a fascinating quote. What exactly does that mean? And I think maybe one interpretation could be that, they're looking in the dark, they're looking at nothing in particular, or maybe they're looking in the darkness and they see God. Maybe that's all that the people in the black community have in this time, in a time where there's a lot of systemic racism and Jim Crow and all of that going on. All they really can have is God, and hope that God provides and protects them. But God is a terrifying force, as you see in this quote. Is that what Hurston is trying to say? I think I might be reaching a little bit. I would be interested in hearing what you all think the title refers to. Is it just simply a line, or is there something more that Hurston is trying to get across? Hurston is also touching upon black women and the misogyny and racism that they face, the intersection there. Janie's womanhood in this story is seen as a burden by many people. By her grandmother, where she has her sexual awakening, and her grandma's like, we got to marry you off as quickly as possible to prevent anything bad from happening. It's not enough that Janie's just a sexual being, at this time, that she's just having a relationship. She's got to get married so nothing bad happens to her. which, given what her grandmother has suggested, that her grandmother was sexually abused by her master and as a slaveholder, maybe she's worried that the same thing might happen to her. But it still doesn't mean that her womanhood should be a burden like that. And even her husbands kind of treat her with disregard there. Like, her first husband just wants her to be a housekeeper, doesn't really care to love her or doesn't want her love at all. It's none of his concern. And then Joe only sees her as a trophy wife, and all the things that she's capable of doing, including public speaking and being a good member of the community, that doesn't matter to Joe. It's a burden to him for her to sort of go out there on her own. He just wants her as a trophy wife. And then even that seems the case with Tea Cakes. Tea Cakes might love her, and she might love Tea Cakes, but it still doesn't change the fact that he's trying to assert some control over her. I think there's a point at the story where another black woman mouths off to Tea Cakes, and he takes it out on Janie and abuses her as a way to reassert his dominance. And it's that's a lot of violence to be placing on a woman. There's quite a bit of misogyny there. Again, you see that abuse, the discounting of Janie as a human being with human thoughts and emotions, and there's a sense of wanting to make her financially dependent, especially if she gets her inheritance. When she does get it, a lot of men think, oh, a woman shouldn't have that kind of money, they shouldn't trouble themselves. But Janie's not willing to cede that control because she knows these men want her to be financially dependent so that they can do all sorts of mean or terrible things and just control her life in the way they want, which Janie doesn't want. She wants a little bit more control over what she does in the world. Now, there is also an interesting quote at the end of the story where Janie has been sentenced and found not guilty for the crime of killing Tea Cakes. And Janie overhears someone say, oh, those black women and those white men are the same. Black women and white men can get away with anything these days, which, is not really true. It's a very weird thing to say, especially I think a black individual says it about Janie. Some internalized racism taking place, which I'll talk about in a few moments. But essentially, that goes contrary to what her grandmother said at the beginning of the story, how her grandmother was sexually abused by her white master. And then the wife of the slave owner was deeply upset that Janie's grandmother gave birth to a mixed race child who was the master's, because it put a bit of shame on the family. But it's an even bigger shame for someone to sexually abuse someone in that way in the first place. So that's an entirely different thing. But black women do not have it easy. Black women do not get away with anything. They are often the scapegoat, and even black men kind of put all their stress back on the black women in an effort to sort of gain more control of their own life and feel like they aren't just a tool of the oppression of the world. But in doing so, again, there's more violence and misogyny placed on black women, which I think is what Hurston is getting at in this story. Hurston is also talking quite a bit about internalized racism. She's highlighting how black groups often spread racism within the own community, either knowledgeably or accidentally, through one reason or another. There's a maintaining of a pecking order. Like black men are above black women in particular, and you have certain dudes at the top who make the rules, and the white order of the world in particular, maintaining the white hegemony, where black people or white people are above black people, and you don't mess with that, even though you should fight that whenever possible. That's a facet of this world, this very real world that Hurston has created. There's also the use of the N-word, which is typically a word used to oppress black individuals. It was created by white individuals to denigrate the black community. Now, I'm not going to be the kind of person who polices that, who says, oh, black people shouldn't use that word. I'm just acknowledging, the history of that word and how black people in the story are using that word. Specifically, they're using the hard R, which is typically the more aggressive and violent aspect of that word, whereas if you use the A, that's slang that people often use in the black community. So using that to describe another black person, you're willingly or unwillingly passing on the violence of that word to another member. And then there's the teardowns of people, criticizing other members of the Black community, which isn't necessarily a great thing. And at one point, I think at least one black character notes that, it doesn't matter what the white people do. Like, they can oppress all they want, but the Black community doesn't need help, like, oppressing themselves. They're perfectly fine of doing it on their own. Allow me to read you the quote from this. "Us colored folks is too envious of one another. That's how come us don't get no further than we do. Us talks about the white man keeping us down, shucks. He don't have to. Us keep our own selves down," which is a frequent idea that's repeated in the Black community, even in the present day, that there's so much internalized racism and so much policing of Black culture that, Black individuals are more than capable of spreading this racism that exists. And that's a frequent sort of area of discussion between major influencers, major historical figures in the Black community. There's a specific part where Hurston mentions Booker T. Washington in this story. And there's a frequent debate that took place between Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois about where the Black community should really go, with Washington suggesting that they stay segregated and they work on themselves, and eventually they'll rise up through that, and maybe even the white community would one day accept them. Kind of a weird line of thinking, in my opinion. And then there's W.E.B. Du Bois, who suggested that they create like these HBCUs, these Black colleges, and Black individuals rise up that way through education and success in that way. And that went back and forth. And in this story, Hurston specifically has one character say that Booker T was a traitor for saying you should capitulate to Jim Crow and white racism. Whether or not Hurston actually believed that, because she had a whole bunch of different thoughts about Booker T. Washington, remains to be seen. But it's interesting that she brings up that discussion, because that does pertain to internalized racism and what Black individuals are capable of. Now, all of this should be noted that it is in parallel to the already existing racist systems that take place in the United States. You see that with the court in this story, where Black individuals go there to speak out against Janie, but the judge says, he specifically uses the N-words and tells them to shut up or else they'll be sent off to jail, which isn't good. And then there's the hurricane that takes place, and how like white individuals are given coffins, whereas Black individuals are buried in shallow graves. That happened in real life in the specific hurricane that Hurston is referencing in this story. And then you also see that with the doctor in this story, where Tea Cakes refuses to go to the doctor even though he has rabies, or he's very sick. At least that's what he thinks. And I think there's some reasons for that. One might be Tea Cakes knows he's not going to get served by the doctor. He might have gone to the doctor before and he had no luck because of the Jim Crow laws that existed in that era. But it might also be the case that he knows that the doctors would do some weird things to him. This was around the time of the Tuskegee study, where they experimented on Black individuals, and Tea Cakes might know something about that, although it didn't become public knowledge till later. But he knows that something is up when you go to the doctor as a Black man. So there's that racism and how it plays a big role in the story as well. It's also important to acknowledge the contemporary criticism of this story, because at the time, people like Ralph Ellison and many other writers criticized this story for saying it didn't do enough to sort of highlight the Black experience. That Zora Neale Hurston was a talented writer, but it was very soft in some capacities. Because if you consider like Ralph Ellison's The Invisible Man, where he directly confronted the white reader and said, this is your doing. The people are suffering because of you. Zora Neale Hurston doesn't really do that, or maybe she does. It's a thing that you can really make an argument for there. And I can see in a lot of ways this is very soft. It doesn't directly confront anyone. But Zora Neale Hurston is talking about racism in this story, noting especially the hurricane, how Black individuals, were treated differently in burial than white individuals. The court, how Black women are treated in particular. I think rather than directly confronting the reader in their words, she's showing a mirror to what society is at the time. She's using a real hurricane that actually happened. So she's pointing out actual things that are there. She's not necessarily being confrontational in that manner, but you can still say a lot by not being confrontational. I don't think Nella Larson was being confrontational in her story passively. passing, but she still talked about, multiracial individuals and internalized racism and that sort of thing. I think people might have been expecting a little bit more given what else has been written at the time, but that by no means is this, a bad story. By no means is Zora Neale Hurston not doing enough. I think this is very biting and critical, not only of the white community, but the black community too, which is what you should look for in this type of literature. You shouldn't merely say, oh, things are going well. You should highlight all the things that are going bad, especially for black women in particular. Now, that's not to say there's no real problems in this story. I do think one issue is that Hurston kind of breezes by major plot elements. She, Janie gets married to Logan, and there's one chapter where it's yep, Janie and Logan didn't love each other, moving on from that. And then there's this thing where Joe and Janie are married for 20 or so years, and it's just a couple chapters. And it's you could have done more to sort of explore these relationships and rather than just telling us, why they didn't work out. You could show us a little bit more. I think there's more work that could have been done there. It's not enough to really sink the story, but it does feel a bit rushed in those areas. Anyway, those are my thoughts on Their Eyes Were Watching God, a pretty fascinating book, very interesting, very intriguing, definitely worth reading. I checked this book out from my local library. Don't forget to patronize your local libraries. They might have interesting books from the Harlem Renaissance. But yeah, if you have any thoughts about it or you want to say something, let me know in the comments below. Otherwise, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so that more people can find out about this book or this author if they don't already know. Also join the Discord if you want to have further conversations about such books or movies, TV show, that sort of thing. And until then, I wish you the best of luck in your weird and hurricane, hopefully not killing you, based travels. Farewell.